Welcome to Agatha Christie She Watched, our spoiler-heavy look at the movie and TV adaptations of the mystery genre's greatest writer. I'm Bill Peschel of Peschel Press, publishers of the annotated novels of Agatha Christie, and today we'll be talking about industrial fog, police brutality, old women and young lovers, and a bloodstained pussycat. It's The Witness for the Prosecution, the 2016 version written by Sarah Phelps and starring Toby Jones and Kim Cattrall. But first, let me introduce my partner in marriage as well as crime of the fictional kind, Teresa Peschel. Teresa, how you doing today?
Hi, Bill, and it was a terrible thing to see that beautiful, fluffy white kitty be drowned.
Yes, and that's a warning, first of all. And not only are we doing spoilers here, but you should be warned about this episode that there is a dead cat involved.
There is cat brutality. None of us actually care about on-screen brutality of the police nature or of murdering women or anything else like that, but by God, you cannot drown a cat. And it's relatively tastefully handled, but the beautiful white Persian is drowned.
Because it walked through the blood of Kim Cattrall and tracked it across the nice white carpet, and the maid wasn't upset about the carpet.
But she was upset about how the cat basically was like, oh, you're in the way. I need to walk this way. So Kitty walks through the pool of blood, leaving little bloody paw prints behind, and what a well-trained theatrical cat that was. And then Kitty walks across the body and then sits down to sits to wash his paws, to lick the blood, her mistress's blood, off her paws. But hey, the cat has to have clean paws. And the maid was so upset that at basically how the cat behaved instead of like a dog. But hey, it's a cat. They're not dogs. You just have to understand that they're not dogs. And so Janet, the maid, murders the cat.
Which has ramifications for her. So she pays for it in the end.
Oh, boy, does she. It's almost like a dumb witness. When we saw the film adaptation of that, I'm going to say his name wrong because, of course, I can't remember it, but Dr. Gunderson, he told Poirot he had to either adopt Bob or Bob was going to be gassed, and then Dr. Gunderson was gassed soon thereafter by the murderer, and he deserved it for saying that. Poor clever Bob would have to be murdered, and here Janet murders the cat.
Yep. So if you're expecting, when you're going to watch this, if you're expecting the Marlene Dietrich, Billy Wilder version from the late 50s, there are some interesting changes made to this. First of all, it's based on the short story.
Yes, the short story Agatha originally wrote and published in January of 1925, and she called it Traitor's Hands. She chose that title because the solicitor, John Mayhew, thinks to himself about how he has a habit. His wife had pointed out to him about a habit that he had that he didn't even pay attention to, which was taking off and polishing his pince-nez and putting them back. And he is ruminating after the trial. He's watching Romaine Heigler in the box, twisting and turning his hands, and she's thinking, where did he see that before? And then he realizes to his shock and horror that it was the woman who gave him the incriminating letter had exactly the same gesture. Now, when Agatha wrote this story in 1925, or rather she wrote it in 1924 and it was published, as I said, in January of 1925, she was never happy with the ending because this is one of the very few pieces that she ever wrote in which the murderer got away with it. Leonard Vole got away with murder because his wife helped him to do so. And she wasn't happy, and she rewrote A Traitor's Hand as Witness for the Prosecution as a stage play. And when you have seen either the Marlene Dietrich and Tyrone Power and Charles Laughton movie in 1957 or the Beau Bridges and Diana Rigg TV movie in 1982, you are seeing the stage play.
And you read a 33-page version of The Witness for the Prosecution?
Oh, the title was changed when it was published in the story collection.
Oh, so that is Traitor's Hands,
yes,
then?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Traitor's Hands was titled The Witness for the Prosecution when the story was finally collected, and somebody decided, oh, well, we should follow the stage play name, but they keep the in the title. It is not Witness for the Prosecution, it is The Witness for the Prosecution, and that gives you the clue that, hey, this isn't the stage play. I guess that's the point. So if you were expecting the ending where Leonard Vole gets his just desserts when his wife knifes him in court, well, that's not going to happen. They go off and have their happy ever after because she saved him from himself.
And that's one of the many changes that Sarah Phelps made following the original story. And she also, of course, added her take on John Mayhew as well.
Yes, and it is mentioned in the story that he has a wife. You do meet a little bit of the King's Counsel, Sir Charles, very little. All of the stage stuff where you see, and by the way, they go back to the original name for Leonard Vole's wife. It is Romaine in the story.
Oh.
It is an Austrian name, even though it makes me think of a head of lettuce every time. But there you are. So her name was originally Romaine in the short story, and that's why you're getting it now. Sarah Phelps followed the short story, like I said, not the stage play. In fact, I would say that the one part of the short story that she did not pay attention to, and she could have, because it certainly would have added more rationale for Janet McIntyre to be as angry as she was, Emily French did have a ne'er-do-well nephew who sponged off of her and whom Janet was fond of, and that character got disappeared.
We have Toby Jones.
Yes, Toby Jones plays John Mayhew.
Who, if you've seen him in other roles, he has very distinctive facial features. He's a very distinctive look. He was Ratchet.
Yes, he was Ratchet in Murder on the Orient Express with David Suchet.
Yes, and he also plays
a metal detecting fan.
A metal detective hobbyist in The Detectorist.
Yes, he's a detectorist, by the way. He is not a metal detector. That is the tool that they use. They are detectorists.
Which is a very charming series, by the way. It was written by one of the pirates from the Pirates of the Caribbean. It turns out he's one of those British actors who's also a writer and a director and a man of many trades. And it's a very charming series. But here, Toby it's a story of weakness. A lot of it is around him and his weakness and his past that comes back to haunt him.
What's also really interesting about the witness for the prosecution, the short story, as opposed to the play or the movie versions, is you're not seeing the King's Counsel, the Charles Lawton role, as the major focus. No, it's the solicitor. And this is where an American audience looks at this and says, wait a minute, you need two lawyers? I know people lawyer up, but you need two lawyers, and one of them does all of the legwork, and the other one puts on the red dress and the wig and poses in front of the judge in the courtroom, and said yes, because a solicitor, that's one half of the lawyer duties. And then you have the barrister, which is the other half of the lawyer duties, and barristers get to try cases, but solicitors don't.
They stand before the bar, which is where the bar that divides the judge and the officials from the rest of the courtroom. And that's
it
why
is
they're called barristers.
Yes, it is very strange to an American audience. When you watch the film versions of the play, you don't even think about the presence of the solicitor, and John Mayhew is in the stage play. He's a minor character. Here he is the focus of the story. He is the solicitor. He is not by any means a wealthy man. He is and I think Sarah Phelps set that up really, really well. He is really down there at the bottom of the food chain. He is trolling for work by walking up and down, peeking into the prison cells at, I guess it's Wandsworth, and asking the prisoners if they need legal representation. He is trolling for clients like an ambulance chaser. He's wearing clothes that predate the war, and you know the reason is because he can't afford to replace them. And he lives in this little dive of a flat with his very tired, worn-out wife who is deeply unhappy. And he doesn't really notice. There's a scene in there where she is stabbing herself with a needle until she draws blood, and he doesn't notice. And I will say, by the way, that it is clear nobody on that set knew how to sew, because when you hand sew and you do a lot of it, you learn to wear a thimble very quickly because you need to keep from pricking your fingers repeatedly, and I didn't see any thimbles.
When I was getting the images for that, I noticed he was also coughing a lot. And it's attributed to suffering from a gas attack during World War I. This is set in, was it 23 or 26? They said
1923. This is set in 1923, so the war has been over for what?
About 4 years.
4 or 5 years?
Yeah. He served in the military and suffered from a gas attack. And we also see his wife And it was not very clear because she's sitting on a bed and stroking something on the bed, and it's well made, and it turns out that it's her son's room.
Yes, their son's room, their son's sweater, everything is preserved like a shrine.
And it's only later we learn a little more about what the story is behind that. But in the meantime, he's at the jail, and all this is being shot through a filter of industrial fog. You know, when we talk about the romance of fog-lit nights that Sherlock Holmes is walking through.
It's smoke, it's smog, it's pollution. It looked absolutely vile.
And it was apparently yellowish in color. It stained everything. And if you were at all susceptible to lung infections, you would be sick. You were sick as a dog. And that's part of living in romantic Victorian London. And that went on until, I think it was like even in the 40s and 50s. It wasn't until they started moving away from burning wood and coal in stoves, and they had Clean Air Acts, that it started clearing up. And when I say this is all shot this way, I mean every room in the house, in his basement office, in
As
the
he's
streets.
walking through the streets, he's in Wandsworth. Even the nightclubs had a smoky look to them.
You know, everybody was smoking like chimneys there too.
Yeah, that didn't help. I'm sure that didn't help. But you see that he is not an upper-class solicitor. He is very poor. He is on the verge of complete failure. And he isn't going to get a client better than Leonard Vole. And later on, once he has taken Leonard Vole on as a client, he has to persuade a barrister to take the case in the court because he can't do it. He has to find a barrister.
And there's a lovely scene there where he's chasing after the barrister who is descending these magnificent stairs.
Beautiful architecture.
Like he's in
absolutely spectacular architecture.
It's a major class difference because here's Toby Jones in his bowler hat, and he's like 5'1", and this Sir Hugo Meredith is just...
No, I thought that was Sir Charles. Sir Charles was the barrister that he ended up using.
Oh, right. Okay, so he's striding down the stairs looking, 6'5", and he's listening to this case and saying, you want me to take this on? He's been seen outside the flat. He's been taking money from
Emily French.
And then he mentions the money.
That's right. Mayhew says if Vole wins, he inherits Emily French's estate, £185,000 plus, and Mayhew goes on to list them: the flat, stocks and bonds, antiques, jewelry, fine art, furs. Emily French was a very wealthy woman.
And Sir Charles stops and he smiles.
Now, another place where we saw the class difference between Mayhew and Sir Charles is Mayhew is taken aback at how Janet McIntyre acts. Janet is Emily French's lady's maid and, housekeeper, and basically does everything for her. Sir Charles recognizes how upper-class servants, long-time servants like ladies' maids and valets, behave. He doesn't find it surprising. Mayhew does. And that is, I think, an example of the class difference between them, the different experiences that they have had.
So the case surrounds Emily French, played by Kim Cattrall.
And she does an absolutely bang-up job. She really does. The short story describes her as being elderly. The stage play describes her as being elderly. The previous presentations that we've seen have seen her as a dotty, fluffy old lady. But in the short story, at one point, Leonard Vole specifically says she's 40 years older than I am. If he's about 25, that only makes Emily French 65. And there's a difference between a 65-year-old woman and an 85-year-old woman. I don't know what term they used at that time period, but today we would say cougar. And
certainly it's played by Kim Cattrall. That's
boy, and if you remember her as Samantha in Sex and the City, you know what we're talking about. She is a woman with her own income, simply buckets of money. She doesn't have anybody to tell her no other than Janet. Since the nephew was removed, we have no idea if she has any relatives or family of any kind, even distant collateral relatives like third cousins or something like that. We know nothing about her. What we know is that she's bored and she wants her pleasure. And of course, because she has gone through menopause, she can now have as much sex as she can get and not worry about pregnancy. And she can afford to pay for what she wants. She sees Leonard. He's coming down the stairs with a tray of glasses and snacks. He's going up the stairs and she notices him and he notices her and he drops the tray as he's turning around to notice her. Gets fired at once, and then she gets him home, and he is very much overwhelmed by her sumptuous house, her sumptuous manner, and her attitude that I'm paying for you and you're going to do what I want. There's a lovely scene where she insists that he take a bath for her so she can admire his manly form in the bathtub. And she feeds him, and he has to. If he wants to make some money, if he doesn't want to cause a scene, he has to do what she wants because she's the boss. And he is, of course, going to Roger her with the best of them because why not?
And the maid takes an instant dislike. Janet says, you're going to last 2 weeks just like all the others, and then she's going to throw you out. But it turns out he lasts longer.
Yes, he lasts about 3 months. And you see how Leonard is being cleaned up. He has a better haircut. He is better groomed. His clothes have improved because Emily French bought all of this for him. And then she made the mistake. She decided that she was so taken with him because Leonard, in this case, and the character of Leonard Vole is absolutely critical. When you watch the Tyrone Power version, you can understand why a dotty old lady is going to fall for Tyrone Power because he has to be smarmy, he has to be oily, he has to be charming. You have to see both that the maid can look at him and recognize danger, and the old lady can look at him and say, wow. Lots of women look at him and say, wow. When you watch the 1982 version with Beau Bridges, he is a California boy stranded in London, and it just doesn't work because he doesn't look like he cares, and he doesn't care about anybody around him. He's sleepwalking through the park. So here you are with Billy Howell is playing Leonard, and he's just perfect. He's incredibly handsome, and he's eager to please, and he has this charming, innocent naivete, this boyishness about him. He's interested enough in what you're doing that you can project your own fantasies on him, but you do not feel that he doesn't care. He feels unsure, and he wants to please you, and he looks at you with those big puppy dog eyes. What do you want me to do? And so Emily French says, bend over.
Or bend me over.
Or bend me over, or get down on that bed, because that's what we're going to do next.
Yeah.
He works really well because his innocent naivete, his boyishness, his, I don't know how this could be happening, it completely takes in John Mayhew. Mm-hmm. Mayhew is a very unhappy man. He has a miserably unhappy marriage. When World War I started, he was all gung-ho, filled with patriotism, and he and his son both enlisted, and he assisted his son in lying about his age. So
he was 17.
17 on his 17th birthday, killed by gas. Mayhew suffered his own gas injuries, although I think because you find out at the end that he apparently had severe bronchitis, that you wonder how much of it was gas and how much of it was guilt and how much of it was bronchitis. That, you know, he's coughing throughout his life. But he feels a great deal of guilt. He didn't save his son. In fact, he took his son to his death, and now he's got young Leonard, who he just can't believe that Leonard is guilty because he doesn't come across that way. He doesn't come across as a typical street thug. Right.
He's more concerned about how Romaine would react if she finds out.
And Romaine being his wife. And you had said something about Rumpole of the Bailey, which is apparently a book series about a British barrister. And there's a group of...
the Timson family.
The Timson family. Would anybody in the Timson family make you feel, oh my God, this innocent, sweet boy is being railroaded?
No, because they were a Cockney family of cheerful thieves and anything else that happened to fall off the back of the lorry. And that provided Rumpole with a lot of his income so he could buy his plonk at Pomeroy's wine bar. They're John Mortimer short stories, well worth reading if you like humorous British legal stories.
So what I'm trying to get at is that Leonard just oozes sweetness and innocence. He's a little lost lamb, and you just can't quite see him as bashing Emily French in the head. And you really need that because you have to really feel for him. Then the tables are turned and you discovered that, yeah, this sweet, innocent, angelic young man is perfectly capable of bashing someone over the head.
But until then, there's a lovely scene before he goes in to testify. They're in the cells underneath the Old Bailey, and he's having trouble tying his tie. And Mayhew ties his tie for him, and it's what a father would do for his son.
I've seen you do that. I've seen you tie Mark's tie because I sure wouldn't be able to do it.
We also see how John Mayhew meets Romaine Helgar, who's playing in the chorus.
And then he sees her a little bit later on. She has now become the star of the show because, oh my God, her husband is been arrested for murder, and nothing fills the cheap seats like knowing that the star is related to a murderer of the day. And she is singing this sentimental song as she rises on the big, glittery, tinsel moon.
The crescent moon.
On a crescent moon.
Which we'll see again later.
And that's right. We saw the crescent moon at the very end.
Yes, but she's singing, "Let Me Call You Sweetheart," and he is just crying the first time.
One of the strengths of this particular adaptation is she is an actress. She is an actress. It isn't really rubbed in your face because you see her in the chorus and you see her singing on the moon and you don't think, oh my God, she's playing Lady Macbeth. You don't see her do that. But the implication is there if you want it. She is an actress.
Well, there is that scene where before she testifies, you see her in her room rehearsing her lines.
Yes, she is rehearsing her
testimony.
Lines.
So we have Mayhew being very attached to Leonard and Romaine.
Oh, yes. It's almost like they are a redemption for him, that he couldn't save his son, but maybe he can save Leonard.
Yes, and then the story follows the rest of the short story and the movie versions as well. They see very much in trouble, especially when Romaine turns on Leonard and becomes the witness for the prosecution.
And yes, and the prosecution is delighted, especially when they discover that she's not Leonard's wife, because apparently at this time, a woman could neither testify for or against her husband. But if you were living in sin, you could. There's some lovely scenes where King's Counsel and Mayhew are trying to find out from Leonard, was she ever a prostitute? How did she behave? Is there anything we can use against her to discredit her testimony by saying basically she's a lying slut whore? Leonard stands up for Romaine throughout the entire film.
She pays her bills on time.
She pays her bills on time. He cannot imagine that she would ever turn on him. He is just horrified. He can't believe it. And again, I think that this is really well done because it reinforces to Mayhew that he couldn't be guilty. His first thought all the time is of Romaine. And then, of course, you discover that Romaine is clearly the brains in that family. He bashed in Emily French's head because he has apparently impulse control problems, and he couldn't wait a little bit, and she has to think fast. And she knows that nobody's going to believe the testimony of a loving wife, but they will believe the negative testimony of an evil, vengeful, foreign slut. And
Mayhew gets the note, visit the Limehouse district at midnight. He meets this woman who turns out to be Christine Moffat, who was replaced by Romaine in the show, and claims that she was attacked with a hot boiling water and sugar that melted her face, so you get to see her melted right eye and skin flaps and all that,
which I have to say worked so much better than Diana Rigg in the 1982 version.
Yes.
Oh my God,
I'll say that, but not as good as Marlene Dietrich.
Marlene did a really good job.
Yeah, because I was not aware of the story then, and I did not see that woman as Marlene Dietrich until near the end, and that fooled me.
One of the issues that we have with watching the movies in the Agatha Project is by the time you've seen the story for the second time or the third time or the fourth time, you know what's coming, so you lose the shock of the new. You lose the surprise.
So we get Romaine on the stand and the letter being revealed.
And she's angry and she's screaming, and she puts on a really good performance, exactly calculated to make sure that the jury loathes her. And, well, he couldn't possibly be guilty. That's what they're thinking.
Right.
So basically at that point, it wouldn't have mattered what the judge did in his summation because the jury had already decided that lying, conniving bitch.
Because this is a jury of 12 men.
That's right. It is a jury of 12 men. And remember, we watched the King's Counsel and Mayhew discussing with each other and then with Leonard, is she a prostitute? In fact, I think, if I remember correctly, at one point, the King's Counsel, Sir Charles, says, I will say actress, and they will hear whore. Because actresses in 1923 and before did not have the best of reputations.
And you could say that was earned. I mean, that's why you had stage door Johnnies waiting outside with champagne and roses. And that also says, when she attacks him and says, evil men, I was wondering how that was set up. But when I think about it now, when you're playing to an audience of 12 men screaming at poor John Mayhew. Remember, she didn't scream at the King's Counsel who was sending her up. She was screaming at the little guy with the pince-nez glasses and saying, evil men, evil men. I could see the 12 guys going, yeah.
I know who's guilty, and it's not him.
That's right.
It's very carefully calculated on her part.
We don't even get to see the not guilty plea. It just jumps right from there with John Mayhew being congratulated by everybody, and he's rising in the business.
Oh no, he collapses. He does
collapse. Yes, he
collapses and he wakes up in the hospital bed a couple of days later, and there's Leonard Vole looking incredibly well groomed and turned out, and he gives him this beautiful watch. Thank you for saving me. It's at that point that you really start seeing some of the weaknesses of John Mayhew, because this is a John Mayhew character study. It is not a Leonard Vole character study. John Mayhew, remember, he has his wife, he lost his son, he doesn't see his wife stabbing herself with the sewing needle right in front of him. He gives her this beautiful blue-green scarf, and we never see her wear it, and he doesn't apparently notice. He doesn't really notice her. It's like he doesn't quite follow through, and so he meets Christine and gets the letter from her, and he has no money on him because he is one step away from bankruptcy, and she says, you have to come back with money. Oh, of course I will. Yeah, he fell over and collapsed and ended up in the hospital for a couple of days, but he never goes back to Limehouse to pay Christine. And then while he's in the hospital, Leonard comes up to him, gives him the watch, and says, I feel like I should do something for Janet, because the way the will was rewritten by Emily French, she gave all the money to Leonard Vole, and she didn't leave any kind of a bequest or stipend for any of her servants, including the gardeners, because I guarantee you that Janet McIntyre didn't keep up that lily pond. She left nothing to Janet. And Mayhew thinks about Janet and says, no, you shouldn't give her anything. That was a piece of cruelty, because Janet is not going to be, she is an older woman, and it's going to be darn hard for her to find a position that was as good as that one.
Even if she was, in his eyes, vindictive about Leonard and so certain that he killed her mistress, it's still human, because that's how you did as servants. You did servants by pensioning them off and making sure they have a little bit of income, because, of course, at the time you didn't have the welfare state.
And there comes a point where you can't work, and so you pension off elderly servants so that they can have a little flat and a little bit of freedom and a little bit of money, and they can manage. He threw Janet McIntyre out into the street. That was Mayhew's choice, because Leonard Vole made the offer, and he said, don't give her anything.
Yeah, and he also got John Mayhew to sell the house.
And gave him a huge wad of money, 40%.
40% commission. So he all of a sudden comes into money, and he's notorious for being successful.
And you can see that his star has suddenly risen in the world. He's got some money. He's getting social status. He's getting better clientele. He has a beautiful new office with his name painted on the door. He no longer has to go trolling in the jail cells looking for clients. Everything is going great. And then you reach the real climax, which is he takes his wife to France. We're going to rekindle our relationship, even though he says he loves her, but he doesn't really see her. He doesn't really see Mrs. Mayhew. They get to this beautiful hotel.
The seaside resort.
A seaside resort, and he sees them. It's because it's several years later. It's Leonard and Romaine. She has gotten out of jail.
She served time for perjury.
Yep, served time for perjury because she lied on the stand. And they have just gotten married, and he's just shocked. absolutely shocked. And he goes up to their room.
I don't think he recognized her.
Yeah, that's right.
He went
that's
up
right.
with a bottle of champagne in an ice bucket and
That's
knocked
right,
on the
because
door
he saw Leonard Vole, but
with
he
a
saw
red-haired woman.
with a red-haired woman in a veil that covered her face. She was wearing a very 20s vintage wedding dress with a veil. And so he thinks, oh, Leonard must have met some nice girl. And he goes up with a champagne bucket, and he walks into the room, and it's Romaine Heigler. You married? What? And he's just absolutely shocked, and they tell him the truth. That, yes, Leonard killed Emily French, and Romaine set everything up very carefully on the spur of the moment because it was the only way she could save him. She loved him so much. There's a lot of love and passion in this movie. She loved him so much that she perjured herself to save him from the noose.
And Mayhew is shocked by all this, not only for this, but because Leonard got off, Janet got tried.
That's right, because he had to find another murderer. He really did want to solve the murder of Emily French. There's this point at which, I think it's right after the trial, he goes back to the house. He's getting the house.
They're getting a house ready for sale.
That's right. They're getting the house ready for sale. And so he's walking around. He walks out into the back garden, and he notices a statue has been knocked over next to the lily pond. And he writes it, and then he sees something in the pond. And it is, I'm sorry to say this, it's Mimi the cat. Janet was so upset by seeing the cat walk across her mistress's body that apparently after the police left, taking the body with them, she took the cat into the back garden over to the pond and drowned that beast, trying to wash the blood off of it and off of her. She was that upset. Mayhew starts thinking, well, who else could have killed her? And then he looks at how she snapped and strangled the cat and drowned it. Maybe she did that to Emily French. And then this cycles back to an earlier scene when he is trying to come up with ideas for the King's Counsel, Sir Charles. And Sir Charles says something along the lines of, I cannot imagine how we are going to frame a case about a nymphomaniac old lady and a deranged lesbian maid. And that's exactly what they end up doing.
But there's also a case where apparently she had gone to the lawyer.
That's right. She went to the lawyer like the day of the murder.
After Emily had rewritten the will.
To find out if Leonard Vole was accused of murder,
if
then
he's convicted, what happens?
What
and they
happens
say
to
the
the
previous will comes back in and she would get her portion.
I do have to wonder, I would have to watch it a second time to find out the timing, because maybe she went and saw the lawyer the next morning after the murder. Because it seems really kind of weird that she would go the morning of the murder to the lawyer, but if she went to the lawyer the morning after the murder, that would make more sense to me if she's innocent. Or when I think about it, it was not clear. Mayhew points out the dead cat to
Detective Bream.
Yeah, Detective Inspector Bream, and he starts looking into Janet McIntyre. They discover that she had indeed gone to the lawyer to ask about the will and what happens if Leonard Vole is convicted of murder. Well, they need a suspect and they need to clear the case, and obviously she's a deranged lesbian lady's maid, so...
She was nominated.
She was nominated
and hung.
Yes, nominated, convicted, and hung.
So John Mayhew has that on his conscience as well. And then he goes back to his room, knowing that all this has happened, and meets his wife.
And I did it all for you. I did it all for love. And she,
I love you. But she doesn't say I love you. And he's trying to wrangle that out of her. And she finally snaps and tells him the truth.
I hate you. I have hated you ever since you murdered our son. And we can manage together as a married couple. I will see that you are taken care of. I am never going to let you touch me that way again.
You can find a mistress now that you're wealthy.
Yes, you can find a mistress.
And he says, I only want you.
But, when you think about it, it's like he never saw her. He was working very, very hard. But at the same time...
He never let her into his life. He never tells her about the cases. I think the one thing she did, she was able to give Leonard Vole a clean shirt for his testimony.
That's right.
But there wasn't any indication that there was anything else going on between them.
Yeah, that there was an emotional connection. And I think about how she sat across the table from him, mending his, darning his socks or whatever it was that she was doing, some kind of handwork without a thimble. And she's stabbing herself in her finger as though she is trying to feel something. and he doesn't notice.
Comes to realize he's never, as she says, I think you don't want love, you want forgiveness. And he's not going to get it from her.
He is not getting it from her. And so he is just so devastated. Leonard Vole got away with murder. He had an innocent woman hung. He still, none of this redeemed his son, who died on the battlefields in France, gassed on his 17th birthday. His wife will never forgive him. Never. Because he lied about their son's age in order to get his son into the army. So he walks out onto the tidal flats, and it takes a little while. I guess it must be low tide. And he walks out into the ocean, and there's the crescent moon in the sky. And you're right, the same crescent moon that we saw Romaine sitting on a stage singing, Let Me Call You Sweetheart.
And this was like the last half hour of the movie. It was like 90 minutes all the way up to the trial and the ending. And then there's like more? There's more story to this?
There were things that I didn't like. When Leonard met Romaine on the front lines in World War I, I just couldn't buy it. Absolutely not. First off, what is she doing alive out there in an empty bunker? And where are all the other soldiers? Where are the bodies? Where are the destroyed vehicles? I mean, those places looked absolutely horrifying. They were charnel houses, and there would have been bits of
bodies everywhere. And weapons and ordnance
and you know, broken up vehicles, and all you see is mud flats. It's just mud. I mean, it's almost like the mud flats. It's as empty as the mud flats that Mayhew walks across to get to the tide. It's as empty as that. And those tide, you know, the mud flats wouldn't be empty, and neither were the battlefields. And I just can't believe that that's how Leonard Vole met Romaine. I could believe if he met her in a basement cabaret. I could believe if he met her in a whorehouse behind the lines.
Which apparently that's where she ended up. Her parents took her to Belgium, and the Germans invaded and apparently killed her parents along with thousands of other civilians, which sort of happened. You know,
there were a lot of atrocities.
There was a lot of atrocities then.
No question.
And then apparently she was taken to France, where she was serving with the Germans because she could sing. She could entertain.
She could entertain the troops in their own language. Remember, as an Austrian,
she knew German.
She spoke German because that's what they speak in Austria. They speak German. They have this pretty young girl who can sing songs in their own language and
entertain them in other ways.
Entertain them in other ways too, I'm sure. And if Leonard had met her in the whorehouse behind the lines and she is desperate to escape, I could buy that. But no, I could not buy any of that, of him discovering her in an empty bunker in a sea of mud, no bodies, no ruined vehicles, nothing. Just couldn't buy it. I do think that the one thing that Sarah Phelps could have put in was expanded the role of Emily French's nephew, because I always notice when you have people who apparently have no ties whatsoever to anyone, and that's really unlikely. I understand that it makes for simpler storytelling, but that's not real. Even if you just saw them in the background, a mention of her angry relatives on her husband's side. You know, what do you mean she's giving all that money to that worthless bounder? Anything that said she was not 100% isolated from every other human being on the face of the earth, because nobody is. You know, unless you were a genuine orphan, and if you were a genuine orphan, you're probably not going to be marrying the incredibly wealthy Mr. French and inheriting his factory or whatever it is, because Mr. French would have relatives. What, you were both orphans?
So how would you compare this with the Marlene Dietrich version? I assume of the three, the Jeff Bridges version is going to be the third.
Bo Bridges.
Bo.
It's
okay.
Bo.
Oh, that's right, Bo with his bulbous face, and not Jeff Bridges. He was much cooler. His cooler brother. Yes, he was the Lebowski. So
I think they were both very good. They're different. They're different, and it depends on how you feel about watching a murderer get away with it. Because with the stage play, and I see why Agatha made these changes, with the stage play, Romaine discovers to her shock and horror that she did everything for love. She was willing to perjure herself for love in order to save Leonard. And then she discovers after the trial, when she is going to be hustled off to jail for several years for perjury, but Leonard is safe and he's got all of the money and he'll wait for her. And then this blonde cookie shows up. Oh, Leonard, now we can go on that cruise you promised. And she knifes him. He had it coming. But in here, they get away with it. And Janet McIntyre is hanged. I mean, she did murder the cat, but...
Hanging is a little too
Hanging is a little too much for murdering the cat. It's very much grittier than the 1957 version. The emphasis on John Mayhew, solicitor, instead of Sir Charles, the King's Counsel, makes a huge difference. I liked them both. I would skip the Beau Bridges, Diana Riggs version, but I liked both of them, but they are not the same movie and really shouldn't be compared because the tone is so different, particularly at the ending.
Well, and if you're interested in it, you can see both of them and you'll have a lot to talk about.
And one of the things, of course, that you have to pay attention to is at the end when Mayhew confronts Leonard and Romaine in the hotel room and they spout off about how you made us this way because you sent us to war. Well, you know, folks, millions of people go to war over the billions over the course of history, and they do not come home and cosh old ladies over the head. They don't. They just cope.
Oh, and they were saying, oh, yes, I'm a monster. Romaine is a monster. And so are you, John. And I'm thinking, no,
because he had his failures, but he didn't kill anybody.
Yeah. And,
he didn't deliberately murder someone, and he had no intention of having his son die, I'm sure, but it was just the patriotic thing to do.
And there were a lot of men who went off to war in that same spirit in 1914. They thought they'd be home by Christmas, and they came home very different.
They came home very, very different. So when you watch Leonard and Romaine self-justify, they're wrong.
And that must be one of the frustrations I felt, is that you just really wanted Mayhew to say, but I'm not like you. But he couldn't. He was a weak man.
He was not able to say, you're wrong, because most of the young men who came back, or the older men who came back, they did not murder anyone. They got on with their lives as best they could. Leonard Vole was always a user. He lucked out and won the genetic lottery with his looks and his mannerisms. But he's part of the Timson family.
Yeah, but there's also the case as well. I'd be curious to talk to lawyers and barristers about this because they go through this frequently. They go into a case, they know he did it, or they know he didn't do it, and justice was not served. And I told you this story. I met an etymologist at a writers' conference. He was talking about his book on bugs, using bugs in legal cases to establish guilt or innocence. And he had just came in from Seattle. He had just testified at this trial in which he knew the guy did it. And he had the evidence to show it, but the jury disagreed. And I said, how do you feel about that when that happens? And he had to shrug and say, well, you just have to go on to the next case. There's nothing you can do about it. And this is John Mayhew is in the same situation.
And he should be able to go on to the next case because sometimes you lose. Sometimes you make a mistake. Granted, he made a pretty big mistake with Janet McIntyre, but she wasn't sympathetic and Leonard Vole was. So he went with the sympathetic person, which proves also that you should pay more attention to your facts. And this is, again, this shows John Mayhew is not Poirot or Miss Marple because he made some really basic mistakes. And you could see that there was enough time passing that he could ask these questions.
He could have followed up on Christine Moffat, going back to the theater where she was acting and asking around to find out what did happen to Christine. And then he would have learned, oh, she went off to have a baby.
He would have asked that question. He would have known he was being lied to. Now, granted, he didn't have a lot of time, but he could have asked questions, or the same thing like with Romaine and supposedly her having a husband in an asylum or some story like that. Again, if you've got a little bit of time, you send someone off to ask questions. He took everything they said to him at face value. And Poirot and Miss Marple would both tell you, never trust anything, never believe anything anybody tells you without verifying it from someone else.
So this is our discussion for the witness for the prosecution. This is part of the Sarah Phelps Film Festival.
Yes, and this is the one that's set in the 1920s. Next time will be, I think, coming up next is Ordeal by Innocence, and that's going to be set in the 50s.
And we still have the ABC Murders with John Malkovich to come.
Which is set in the 1930s. And,
so we've seen The Pale Horse, which we loved.
Yes, set in the 1960s.
And we saw And Then There Were None.
Set in the 40s.
Which we loved as well. So, this so far, she's very highly recommended here because we do like this. So she's 3-0 so far.
Even with the flaws, she's 3-0. And when you compare her to some of the other adaptations, I think she's true to the spirit. She can play fast and loose with the text, but not the way some of the other productions have done.
Like the Sittaford Mystery.
The Sittaford Mystery. Oh, God. But she is putting Agatha Christie in front of a new audience that might not have ever considered her.
Which is also quite fascinating, as we're seeing now with objections to current IPs being used, such as Lord of the Rings with the Rings of Power, and how they really are going off the reservation with regards to staying true to the spirit of Tolkien. And how we see this, you can still tell a compelling story and remaining true to the original source material.
Yes, you can, and I would recommend this.
So
Don't watch the 82 version, though.
Unless you're a Diana Rigg fan, but frankly, there's plenty of... Go watch your Avengers reruns.
No. Go watch Evil Under the Sun.
Oh, yes, definitely.
Wow.
Yeah, that was great.
That was great.
And this is Agatha Christie, She Watched, with Bill Peschel.
And I'm Teresa.
And we'll see you at the movies. Agatha Christie, She Watched is Teresa Peschel and Bill Peschel. Produced by Bill Peschel. Theme song, Call to Adventure, by Kevin MacLeod. New episodes come out every week wherever you stream your content. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can help support us by going to anchor.fm/mystery and leaving a 5-star rating and review, and by helping to spread the word. To advertise on Mystery She Watched, email Peschel at peschelpress.com. All questions and comments can be emailed to Peschel at peschelpress.com. And thank you for listening.